Good afternoon. Thank you for being here with us today. It is a major honor for me being your guest to present this webinar about the situation in Venezuela. This is a series of webinars that the Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation has been organizing to inform about the situation in different countries in Latin America and in exploring the threats to democracy and the authoritarian advance in several countries in Latin America, and the advance of communists, of course, in several countries. And there are some key countries that we like to analyze. That is the case of Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, but we have been also exploring the situation in Ecuador and also in Guatemala and in other countries. It is more than a pleasure for me and a great honor to have an extraordinary expert with us, Pedro Burelli, longtime friend. We have been friends for forever. And I admire his work. He has been a successful business person with different entrepreneurship and business in different countries, including a wonderful work in the PDVSA in Venezuela. He also was part of the successful PDVSA before Chavez. The PDVSA that was one of the major companies worldwide, oil companies worldwide. And also Pedro Mario is an expert in Cuba, Russia, Venezuela. He has a different approach than the normal analysts that we used to bring to this program. Pedro Mario covers different interactions among different factors at the same time: political, oil, the intervention of Russia and China in Venezuela and other countries. So it is a wonderful opportunity to learn what's going on in Venezuela, why the situation has been getting to this point, why we have this crisis, failed negotiations in Venezuela, the alternative also for the U.S. administration from the point of view from the expert. So it is a major pleasure to have this conversation. And remember, the ones that are connected with us by Zoom, you can send us some questions directly to Pedro Mario or to me, and we can review those questions. And we also have the possibility to share this wonderful webinar through YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And you can also watch this webinar in our webpage in a couple of days. We will save we have been saving all the webinars in VOC webpage. Pedro, nice to have you here. It's a great honor. What happened in Venezuela? What is the situation right now? How do you see that the current environment in Venezuela, the political, economic, social environment in Venezuela?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Carlos, for inviting me, and thank you for what you do, not only in Venezuela, but around the world. I think your cause is one that I share. And by the way, one that I've shared for a very long time. I think our friendship has always been related to try to deal with common problems, most of them dealing with our country, but sometimes dealing with countries that are going through very similar processes. I want to start by stating that I'm a firm believer in political dialogue and in negotiations. And that belief is strengthened if the alternative to dialogue or successful negotiation is further suffering and war. So I want to make that very clear, okay? There is, those of us who've been critical of the way negotiations have taken place in Venezuela is not at all that an alternative is something that's not negotiated. It's just that there's a whole bunch of rules about negotiations that have to be followed and have not been followed. What I want to do also, Carlos, is there's something I hate, which is listening to long presentations. And the second thing is myself giving long presentations. So what I would prefer is to go very quickly, lay in the land, and maybe through the conversation with you and answering questions from the audience, just go much deeper into the weeds of what I think it's a fascinating and also a very troubling subject. I think any discussion related to the protracted conflict in Venezuela, one that has been affecting all of Venezuela and increasingly the region since a date that I always put in 2001. I mean, Chavez came to power in 99. You could make a whole bunch of explanations of why he came, what kind of crisis we were having that led to his election. But when I look at when conflict really started, it was towards the end of 2001. And I would always put kind of the break of, successful cohabitation in Venezuela starting on the around the 10th of December of 2001 with a major national strike called by the Employers Federation. And I think from then on, the crisis has not stopped. I think if we want to look at that, then we have to focus on four things. I mean, I would say, what is the nature of the problem that we're faced with? What factors facilitate or complicate the crisis? What alternatives do the opposing sides have to a negotiated agreement? And what form should a negotiation take place? What form should it take to improve the chances of success? So that's the way I kind of see it. And it's very interesting that the nature of the problem is very elusive. In a very long crisis, the definition, understanding, and the nature of the crisis changes. Okay, and this is clearly the case of Venezuela. So we have to start making an effort, a real effort to sort truth from myth, facts from rhetoric, wishes from reality. And I think this is, believe it or not, a point in which we are still stuck. All these years and all this suffering and all this coverage and all these attempts to solve the crisis, and I still believe that we're dealing with a crisis that is not properly diagnosed. And that to me is unacceptable. Okay? Reality is very well documented. The past efforts to negotiate, what failed, it's there, it's pretty clear. It's not a very complicated set of facts to understand what's going on. And therefore, I think what we have to do is literally spend some good time talking about what is the nature of the problem. This actually will probably lead us to conclusions that are not very comforting. And there's not easy solutions. Quite the contrary. I think if you do a correct analysis, you will find out that the problem is probably much greater than you thought it was. And to the people who are involved in solving it, probably much greater than they want it to be. But you cannot avoid focusing on the crisis and the nature of the crisis if you want to solve it. Now, what are the complicating factors of this crisis? I think there's an adage that, this is a crisis that Venezuelans have to solve, and this has to be solved between Venezuelans. Venezuelans have to sit down and solve this crisis. I actually think that the longer this crisis has gone on for, it's festered as a problem, the more complex it's become, not because of what the local players are doing, is because of the presence and actions of external elements. The conflicts between those external elements have become quite intertwined and are inseparable from the domestic issues. So it's very nice, and it's kind of a very easy phrase to say, well, it's for Venezuela to solve this problem. But when you look at the problem, then you say, what do we do with the external players and their objectives and the games that they play around Venezuela? So I think it's very important that we do this. Now, what are the alternatives to negotiation? Well, the first thing is that we have to do, what very simple negotiation strategy is figure out what the BATNA is. And BATNA is a term that's used by, in the negotiations literature that defines what's the best alternative that the parties have to a negotiated agreement. So you have to understand what is each party's BATNA. Each party should understand what the other's BATNA is, and that's very important. Now, in extreme cases, I think it's very important also to understand what the what-not is. What's the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement? In any negotiation, we have to focus on this. And I think not enough time has been spent understanding this problem. And I think behind the failure of the negotiations is a failure of doing a fairly good analysis of butness and whatness. And I think we should do that. Now, neither party in Venezuela has easy options that can result in the solution of the problems of Venezuela's, of millions of Venezuelans, and now of the region. This conflict can go on forever too. I mean, so that's part of the what now, the worst alternative negotiated agreement. This problem can fester. We can see that what used to be the most prosperous, the richest country, and from a natural endowment, probably the richest country in Latin America, could actually look like, behave like, feel like, Somalia in the Caribbean. That is a possibility. As a matter of fact, I would state that there's probably a higher likelihood that this problem does not get resolved, that it actually gets resolved satisfactorily. So the what now, what is the worst alternative to negotiated agreement, is something that does not look very pretty and something that doesn't really have a precedent. I would say right now, as we see both in the views of human rights and the level of poverty and all that, when we look at Venezuela and we say that Venezuela right now on a per capita basis is poorer than Haiti, that's an absurdity, but it's also a reality, okay? Can it get worse? Yes, it can get worse. 5.5 million people have left. Can 10 leave? Yes, it can happen. And there's a lot of scenarios where that could happen. So when we look at the shape of negotiation then, I mean, as a fourth point is, what kind of negotiation has to take place? And I think one of the problems is that every attempt, and there's been a lot of attempts of negotiation. When I mentioned 2001 as the beginning, I actually was referring to negotiations that were taking place between Venezuelans. At that moment, the business community, and to some degree the political parties, with Hugo Chavez's nascent government. I mean, this was the first few years, that broke down as Chavez decided to use an enabling law to push forward a set of laws that were basically beginning to change the nature of the social contract of the economy in Venezuela. And that led to this national strike, from which then in 2002, we ended up with a series of strikes. We ended up with a coup in April. We ended up with protests at the end of October. And then we ended up with an oil strike, and then the beginning of formal negotiations with outside parties. And since then, it hasn't stopped in terms of attempts to stop the crisis or the crisis getting worse. So the nature of the problem, what kind of negotiation, what information do we have about what's going on, should lead us to understand that we have failed in the manner in which we have approached the negotiations. The approach has always been as if we're facing a political crisis. Yes, we're facing a political crisis, but it's a political crisis among many other crises. I mean, it's a crisis that affected the body politics of the country, but it's affected the economy, the social arrangement, has affected the infrastructure, has affected education, has affected the health system, and has affected every aspect of the coexistence of this country. Politics is just one component. Dealing with this as if it were just a political crisis is not going to yield an outcome. When people say we have to seek a free and fair election, yeah, that solves one problem. It doesn't solve a lot of other problems. And and then when you go into how do you get to a free and fair election, is that you find the rest of the problems lurching. Is that when you realize what's happened to this country over the last 22 years, and I'll be more open and objective, maybe over the last 40 years. But what has happened is that the entire model of the society, a country that basically has had a model for about 100 years, very much driven by oil, society completely driven by oil, in which politics, the society, the economy was driven by oil, has come crashing down. Everything that we knew as certain in Venezuela is no longer certain. And we have a situation right now at this particular moment in a multidimensional and systemic crisis in which the growing criminalization of the affairs of state and of daily life is unstoppable. So this is a problem. You know, we have something that might have started as a political power play and now has become a very criminal problem. The criminal elements are dominating every aspect of politics, every aspect of the economy, and every aspect of normal life as a country begins to look like the Venezuela pre-1920, when the country was fragmented, divided by, controlled by different armed groups, without a sense of direction, without a sense of nation, and at that moment, even without oil. That was oil had not entered into it. We're also now in what almost looks like a post-oil era, with the oil sector completely destroyed and no oil income, which was what fueled not only the life of people, but also the plans of politicians and all that. And maybe also was what fueled Chavismo. And we can talk about that a little bit later. So what we have right now is we're dealing with a situation that's akin to a collective kidnapping, a very prolonged hostage crisis. And this is not a very easy solution. But why do I call it a kidnapping? It's very clear. I mean, it doesn't take a lot to say those holding power today illegally, and it's illegal because Maduro stole an election in 2018, and I won't go back to 2013. In 2018, he stole an election. 72 countries in the world did not recognize that election. He decided to swear himself in 2019, and that has triggered a crisis because under our laws, what is really happening in Venezuela is the usurpation of power. Somebody is playing the role of de facto government and is holding on to power by abusing the power of the state. There's an abusive exercise of power through means that are considered criminal under the laws of Venezuela, under international law, under the treaties that Venezuela is a signatory to. And I'd like to make special reference, and we'll talk about the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. So the mode in which power is being exercised is criminal. It's in the violation, the absolutely constant, persistent violation of the laws of the country. And a small group of people, by exercising power in that fashion, has basically the entire country, and to some extent, and growingly, elements in the region, hostage to its absolutely capricious use of force. Now, that also explains why 5 million people have left the country, okay? The problem here, and we have to focus on, is that the problem is not easy, not because there's an opposition that's fighting for its rights. No, it's because there's a regime, a de facto regime that's holding on for dear power. I mean, they're holding on, they just won't let go. Now, the exits and the real exits in the negotiation also refer to, and this is why I also say it's a kidnapping, is that the people on one side have committed a series of crimes. And I'll just list them very quickly. They've ransacked the country, so corruption, kleptocracy at a very high level. They've been involved in illegal activities like narcotics trafficking, illegal mining. Associated with that, they've laundered billions and billions of illegally gained money, not just from their activities, from activities of other criminal gangs that have found in Venezuela a very good place to launder their money. And third, this regime has abused human rights to the level of crimes against humanity. Now, I'm not saying this as an opposition figure. This is being said by independent teams that have looked and studied what's going on in Venezuela. So in the case of narcotics, the United States legal system has countless indictments against Maduro and the top echelon of the government for being involved in narcotics activity. They have indictments. So they're people who are being sought by the United States justice for crimes of narco trafficking. In the case of the human rights abuses, independent commissions set up by the Secretary General of the OAS, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the fact-finding mission set up by the UN Commission on Human Rights, all have found that these violations are occurring. So part of the problem where we're stuck is that the individuals sitting on one side of the table have made a good exit for them almost impossible. And on the other side, you've got an opposition that, with all its faults, and we could spend an hour talking about the faults, if we're also willing to talk about an hour discussing how difficult it is to be a politician in an autocratic and increasingly criminal situation. The opposition is not asking for anything other than the Constitution. By the way, a Constitution that was drafted by a Chavista majority and sold to the Venezuelan people by Chavez. So it's the Chavista Constitution. The opposition is only asking that the Constitution be upheld. They're asking nothing else. The opposition, which is very interesting in such a protracted case, has never developed an armed group. So there's never been a tit for tat in terms of the violence that the regime is being used has never been answered with violence on the side of the opposition. That actually, in an interesting way, complicates the normal negotiations where you could have a truce, you have a ceasefire, all those things. None of that exists. So what we really have is a situation that looks and is being treated as if we're a political thing. We're trying to find political solutions, but it looks much more like a kidnapping. And for a kidnapping to occur, almost in any circumstances, for a kidnapping to occur is because there's an asymmetry of force. Okay? A young boy with a lollipop can kidnap you. A young guy with an AK-47 can kidnap anybody. There's an asymmetry of force there. I'm walking down the street, a kid comes up to me with a lollipop, he cannot do anything to me. But he has an AK-47, and I have no idea what the outcome of that is. And if you take that a little bit longer and expand it to a bank robbery, if 5 guys walk into a bank and they stay there for a long time, usually it's not the people who've been kidnapping the bank, whether they're cashiers, secretary, or clients of the bank. They're not the ones who negotiate their freedom. Somebody else that has what the kidnappers want is the person that gets involved in the negotiation. And you always will get, carrots and sticks in those negotiations. Well, it's very difficult in an approach like we're dealing in Venezuela to have the Venezuelan opposition they have no sticks. The Venezuelan regime has all the sticks and is willing to use them. So that's why I say that when we look at the situation in Venezuela, if we really analyze the problem, we might understand, one, the approach to negotiation is different. The possible success of negotiation is lower. And the whatnot, the worst case, is probably larger because the individuals are not disputing. This is not a political dispute. This is a much more complex dispute. And when people talk about possibilities of coexistence, democratic coexistence and that, it is almost impossible to imagine that you could create a government between indicted criminals and innocent victims. It does not work. So we have to move to a stage where the negotiation actually does involve players that have what the kidnappers want and what the kidnappers fear. And that, in my mind, means that elements of the international community have to be involved. And I did mention at the beginning that one of the complicated factors is that there are foreign elements involved. Maduro and his cronies are not empowered by themselves. They've got a set of allies that are behind them in any negotiations. I think it's quite important that the people who are supporting democracy get much more engaged in a negotiation. Again, that does not guarantee that a discussion where you have on the one side the US and Canada, European powers, is going to win over a situation in which China and Russia on the other side. So these are complicating factors that I think is what we should be talking about. So the problem here is that what the kidnappers want is impunity, okay? And the ability to maintain what they've stolen. What the opposition or society wants is to live freely, to stay alive. There's also an asymmetry there because the expectation of impunity runs against, as I said, issues like the Statute of Rome. The Statute of Rome that created the International Criminal Court very clearly states that crimes against humanity, which it specifies very clearly, and we can discuss those in the conversation, never prescribe and have universal jurisdiction. While the International Criminal Court is set up to review and try those cases, basically any case, any crime against humanity can be tried in any court because there's universal jurisdiction. So guarantees related to that. When you sit around in a negotiation, if you're seeking impunity, but the fact is that you're governed in a situation where impunity cannot be given, guarantees cannot be provided, we're in a much more complex situation. And my sense is that the reason that we have wasted a great deal of time negotiating, and particularly as the problem becomes more criminal in nature, is because we keep using the tools of negotiation that apply to a political conflict and not the tools of negotiation that one would bring to a kidnapping, a hijacking, a hostage-taking situation. And again, those are not easy tools. And it does not mean that if you change the approach, you'll have success. What he does say is that if you don't change your approach and you try to deal with this as if it were something that it's not, you're not going to solve the problem. The problem is going to fester. Clearly, the reason that we got to this situation is because people have seen the problem get more difficult and they're just kicking the can forward. I mean, this problem in Venezuela, has happened over a long period of time, and in an international behavior, which is, gee, let's push this thing forward, let's push this thing forward, let's push this thing forward. So that's the easy reaction. Okay, well, it failed. Let's try another time. Let's try another time. But what's happening in the meantime of those failed negotiations is that the crisis have become deeper, the suffering have become deeper, and the whatnot, the worst alternative negotiating agreement, is becoming even more dire. So I don't want to extend myself here. As I said, I don't want to have a long conversation, a presentation. I do want to have a long conversation with you, Carlos, and with those in the audience who would like to ask.
Well, thank you very much for that in-depth introduction. And we have been talking about this several times, and also the vision that it's very hard to bring the hostage into the negotiation when they don't have anything to offer. Some of the hostage also has been compromised by the regime with corruption, or they're infiltrating people there. The regime also infiltrated some of the self-called negotiators like Norway, or like the thief of Zapatero. Also, what you mentioned, the elements of short-term views from the U.S. administration and from the international community that have been trying to apply the elements of a political negotiation in a more complex scenario that involve different illegal actors, drug traffickers, money launderers, and also some of the international forces. And you mentioned that China, Russia, Iran, Turkey. It's a whole mix in a country. And we also talk about the short term views and trying to compare Venezuela with Chile, with other transitions, and thinking about a transition Venezuela, not even trying to solve the real problem in Venezuela, and the situation has been escalated. I remember several years ago when I had conversation at the State Department and other places. We had in that moment the caminantes, the people leaving the country was not a major issue, and we were alerting that was a situation. I remember when my first meeting with the former president of Colombia, Santos, and I told him the situation is coming. I don't know if it's going to be months, it's going to be years, but the situation is coming. Everything is driving the country into a border crisis. And he ignored that. And he continued with whatever he was doing, bad policies for Venezuela. So it is a complicated. Let's talk about the actors. You mentioned those actors. I'm mentioning those actors by name: China, Russia, Iran. Those actors need to be part of a negotiation. How we can deal with those actors if they are so engaged with a criminal regime?
Well, I mean, clearly, as I said, one of the great complicating factors that has come with time is the deeper involvement of external players to the crisis, and external players who themselves have problems. So sometimes, and I would say, the growing problem between the United States and Russia has us as a proxy. We're stuck in the middle of this issue. Neither Russia nor the United States are providing a great deal of money to Venezuela, so they're not investing a great deal, but they're very invested in the crisis, and that makes it more difficult. What would get Russia to let go? Are they trying to negotiate something else in their sphere of influence that would make them, be more amicable to an arrangement in Venezuela where Maduro were to leave? The same question is to China. We've got, a set of problems among superpowers, and Venezuela is now a center of operation, and that impacts you in everything. If you want a solution to the United Nations, and you want to go to the Security Council, and as it's happened, because when people say, well, we have to go and find multilateral solutions, those have been tried, and you go to the Security Council and you get immediate vetoes from one side or the other, depending on what the issue are. So we are locked in a superpower conflict, and we're just one piece, and a relatively small piece, okay, but a sad piece because of the consequences and the destruction of the society. My sense is that Venezuela also has external non-state actors that are of the serious nature of which I think we have to be very, very careful. The role of the Colombian guerrillas in Venezuela, where they occupy or roam freely around 70% of the territory, that's a problem today, and we're seeing some of the elements in this border conflict that's taking place right now, but it's going to be a problem for a transition. A fundamental issue of a transition is governability, and governability is very related to sovereignty and control over the territory. How do you exercise control over a territory that today is being occupied by foreign armed elements, okay, that consider themselves allies of the regime, that operate almost unperturbed, but they are actually a challenge for the development of a free, democratic, and prosperous society going forward? So those elements are also important. Now, at what point is the suffering of the Venezuelan enough to make all the players put aside their multiple interests around the world and focus on what is going on in Venezuela? I do not know. I mean, I've been very surprised of how deeply Russia has become involved in being the main political supporter of Nicolás Maduro. Every election that has taken place since 2015, where the opposition won an election, every election since then has been observed and enthusiastically backed by Russia, while it's been rejected by most of the democratic world. So Russia is actually playing a more aggressive role as a validator to the Maduro regime. Also, they've armed the Maduro armed forces with very sophisticated weapon systems that Maduro seems to be willing to have, able to have money to do that, but not money to solve any of the problems or to invest in the oil sector or basic infrastructure. But this is a country that's being weaponized by Russian arms merchants. And at the end of the day, once again, at what point does Russia show a hand that they really care about the future of Venezuela and not just are using Venezuela to sell the weapon systems or to play their international game of cat and mouse with the United States? So the real issue, and that's why even in attempts of negotiation taking place, sponsored by the Kingdom of Sweden, in which were just countries. It was a what they call, second story, second floor meetings, in which Russia and China were present. The United States was present. They couldn't advance at all. So it's not only the negotiations that failed when you sit Venezuelan parties, is that also when you sit these foreign parties, external parties, you also fail in the negotiations. So we're really, really stuck. And I think we're stuck because the problem is getting more complicated and the pride of different countries is getting deeply involved. How do you solve that? I don't know, okay? But what I really detest is the notion that these problems will get solved by Juan Guaido sitting across the table with Nicolás Maduro. That's not going to happen, okay? And we can talk about why that can't happen, but just to answer your question about the external elements, yes, this is an incredibly complicating factor and one that destroys the notion that this is a problem that has to be solved between Venezuelans.
We have precisely a question about the external actors. It's about the factors of negotiation, the role of international actors. But the question is, societies like the U.S. and other democratic society, how can they engage and fight against the communist and socialist role in the crisis in Venezuela, and with how a democratic society can play a better role to support Venezuela and help to play a role in a crisis in Venezuela and find a solution for the crisis of Venezuela?
Well, look, I think it's very clear that in January of 2019, we had a constitutional crisis that was resolved by the majority of the democratic countries in the world by saying, yes, I mean, Maduro stole an election, he's swearing himself in, okay, so that's illegal. Since there is no precedent, because we didn't do a proper presidential election, you got a vacuum of power. The Venezuelan constitution is very clear in two articles. In one article, it says that a vacuum of power is filled by the president of the National Assembly. And the other article says that the usurpation of power is the duty of all Venezuelans to fight and struggle to end the usurpation. When 60 countries came in a fairly, I mean, that's a very broad-based alliance, included from Japan to Greece and, going through most of Latin America, we had the democratic powers being involved in the crisis, okay? And it should have generated a crisis. It should have generated a kind of conversation. Russia decided to say, no, this is an imposition of the United States. No, it's not an imposition of the state. Was what the constitution that Hugo Chavez Frias, sold to the Venezuelans. His constitution, the constitution that he pulled out of his pocket every day in a mini version of the constitution. It is that constitution that set out the need or the necessity for an interim government, given that we had a vacuum of power. So we missed an opportunity. That opportunity should have been taken to deal with it at that moment. And it was not dealt that way. The Russians came in saying, President Guaido is just a puppet of the US, and I don't care about the Constitution, and that doesn't exist. And then they talk about intervention. They're intervening. They're interpreting the Venezuelan Constitution according to the way they want to interpret it. That's the real problem when external actors get involved. That's a problem with Zapatero. Zapatero did not like the fact that we had a recall referendum in our Constitution. So when we had a recall referendum, he would say, I don't like the fact that there's a recall referendum in your Constitution. He says, well, I think somebody in the opposition responded, no, we don't like the fact that in your Constitution you have a monarchy in Spain. So what are we talking about here? Are we talking about external players that talk about no involvement, that what the United States does is involvement in domestic affairs, but what they do is not involvement in domestic affairs? And I think this is a false premise. But I think everybody's to blame. I think everybody has seen the problem and run away from its complexity. So I sometimes use a metaphor that I think is maybe valid to illustrate the problem the international community as a whole has had in Venezuela. Is, when you juggle balls, usually you can only juggle 2 or 3. a really good juggler can juggle 8. But what happens if the problem, or a problem like Venezuela, is a 47-ball juggle? Okay? I mean, you'd be stupid to imagine that we require somebody who can juggle 47 balls. That's absurd. Okay? Because the really good jugglers can probably do 8 or 9 balls, and for a very short period of time. The fact here in Venezuela is when you juggle whatever amount of balls you can juggle, and if you create a team, maybe you could combine juggle a few more, look at the balls that you're not juggling. So do not forget about the ones that you're not juggling. So the tendency of the international community has been to pick the issues that they think are important and begin to juggle those and forget about problems that are completely basic underlying problems, and that sometimes are the most, the gravest of problems, the more difficult to deal with. And I have listened to many a conversation in many capitals and in many meetings where it is clear that the external actors have chosen to eliminate from their discussion a lot of these balls and are focusing on the ones that they're comfortable with. That's why they make references to Chile. That's why they start to pick, elements and say, oh, this looks like that. No, this doesn't look like anything, okay? This is a lot more complicated than Chile. This has nothing to do with the negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC. You can pick elements from everything, but when you put all the crises together, you see everything that constitutes a Venezuelan crisis. It requires an international community that is more willing to look deeper, okay, and not make absurd abstractions, and not make personal choices of what crisis do you want to focus on. If you're going to solve the crisis in the long term, you have to deal with the issues, that are making the long term uncertain or highly risky. If you're not dealing with those, the rush to an election, what would a rushed election lead to? Probably a fairly bad outcome, a very short-lived elected government, an ungovernable situation. This country, if you analyze it correctly, needs a transition, a long transition, a very assisted transition from outside. Assistance has to come on security issues, economic issues, technical issues. There's a tremendous amount of assistance that has to come to build a country literally from the ground up, rebuild the institutions, create an environment in which you could end up in elections. Elections is the end game, but it takes so long to get there that you have to focus on the activities that you have to do before you get enamored of the election as a solution. If you think the election is a solution, it's because you concluded that this is just a political problem, and that's not the issue. So when you look at people dealing with Venezuela, I tend to now be quite dismissive as the people who want to simplify the problem. I actually want to complicate the problem. I'm not running away from the realities of the problem. I'm actually want to put it in people's face. This is the problem. It doesn't make it easier to go away if you ignore the difficult issues, okay? But I think there's a tendency in the international community to try to simplify it in order to just not deal with it. Or sometimes, in the case of kidnapping, for example, when you bring somebody to deal with a kidnapping, is a very different kind of expert than what you're negotiating in a political solution. My sense is that both politicians and diplomats in a host of countries have not stopped to bring in those people that they have in their governments that deal with law enforcement issues and with kidnappings, and said, what's the psychology? How do we have to work with a team of people who are entrenched in power, who fear the consequences of losing power, and are actually willing to commit further crimes to hold on to power, which in terms makes their exit more difficult. So I would be happy if I began to see that in these international meetings, you're having people bring in their ministers of justice or people who have negotiated deep crises that involve life and death decisions and not just political disagreements.
And talking about the political disagreements, and also the engagement from the external forces. I want to your views about the different approach from the two administrations, the Trump administration, the Biden administration. We even have a question here that asks about the Biden administration statements supporting negotiations in Venezuela, the negotiation with the National Electoral Council, and with a broader opposition group that sometimes doesn't include Mr. Guaido, and if it's right for the administration to do that. But following that, one of the major engagement from the Trump administration, and one of the propaganda from the Trump administration was the connection with Mr. Guaido and the support, not only with good statement, support, economic support, $87 million for the transition, for the interim government, or whatever the name, support with the international community, doing a huge effort trying to be an advocate for Mr. Guaido and JD4, and supporting that. And now we got the administration with Biden, and needs to look for different approaches, and probably looking for more territorial or other groups. But how do you see that it needs to be the role of the U.S.? It's good for the U.S. to support an alternative. It is the right approach to continue with Trump's policies, short-term policies for Venezuela. What is the approach for? What do you recommend to the Biden administration in your expertise? What is the right approach for Venezuela?
Well, Carlos, as you know, being a complete independent, a business person who actually happened to live in Washington for the last 20 years, I can tell you the one thing that is consistent with every administration that has dealt with Chavismo, and this is starting with the election of Chavez in '98. With the Clinton administration, goes to Bush, Obama, Trump, and now with Biden. The only thing that I've seen that is in common with all of the administrations is that every administration has left the problem worse than they found it, okay? So there's a tremendous consistency in the fact that this problem has become worse year after year, administration after administration. The only thing that changes in the Biden team is that this team just left the problem. This exact team was involved in the Obama administration. When Tony Blinken was a deputy secretary of state, Jake Sullivan was an advisor to the vice president, Juan Gonzalez was an advisor to the vice president. These people were involved directly in the issue. So they left the problem in 2017 much worse than they found it in 2009. The one thing that we have as a benefit is that they're not newcomers. They understand the problem absolutely what it looks like. And that's why there's not a great deal of change in their policy. One, the recognition of Guaido is looking at the Constitution. That National Assembly from which Guaido emerged as president and which Maduro eliminated with a false election that nobody accepted in December 6th of last year, that assembly of 2015 was elected with a great deal of support by the United States. So the Obama team, in their credits, when they want to say, well, we did this in Venezuela, they say, we helped. There was an election in 2015 that led to the opposition taking control of one of the powers of that country. So the dissolution of a body that they claim as something in which they contributed is not something that they're going to applaud. The notion of eliminating Guaido, who has a connection by virtue of being president of the only legal democratically elected body that existed until Maduro tried to destroy it with a fake election. If you eliminate Guaido, then what you really have is a battle of midgets to figure out who's the tallest midget in the opposition in Venezuela. Nobody wants that. So Guaido actually represents a connection to legality around which you could build a bigger coalition. You could bring in civil society, you could bring other players into the game, and I think that's important. But I don't think you want to dissolve the legality that came from the 2015 election. So I do not see that the Biden team has the opportunity to change a great deal or the desire to change that many things. The tools left for the United States are really the same ones that the Trump team used. Sanctions, the actions of a semi or somewhat independent judicial system that follows, investigates the corruption, the narcotics, and all these things of elements within the regime, and working with international partners. Sometimes the Biden administration says, we will do a better job working with international community. Well, the coalition of 60 countries that supported Guaido, that's a pretty good damn coalition. So, what really happens is that when you go to the United Nations, as I said before, you'll find Russia and China. So the issue becomes for the Biden team is, how do we do the same things that the Trump team did, correct the mistakes that they made, do some things that were not done, and negotiate with external players with who they have huge problems. I mean, the problem that the Biden team has with Russia is greater than the problem that the Trump administration had with Russia. So it is very unlikely that with growing tensions between the Biden administration and the Putin government, that you're going to find an easy solution in Venezuela. I think every time the temperature goes up in that relationship, the possibility of a solution that has to involve Maduro and his allies will be an easy solution. It's going to get complex. What I actually celebrate, and again, having watched so many administrations come and go, is that this administration is not starting from square one. They have looked at what the Trump team did. I've actually listened to them in private say, not everything that the Trump team did was wrong, okay? And when Secretary Blinken spoke to interim President Guaido, he said, I just had a conversation with interim President Guaido. That was a huge disappointment for some European players and other actors who wanted the new administration to forget about the interim government and create or invent a new opposition. That's not going to happen. Now, having said that, I think that the Biden team will have to come with a series of actions that involves players that have the ability to negotiate with Maduro and with Maduro's allies. Juan Guaido or anybody that you put across the table for Maduro, they're not asking for anything else than the Constitution be upheld. And positive outcome cannot be that Guaido signs an agreement in which he, representing the opposition, agrees that Maduro can stay in power, violating a set of articles of the Constitution. That's the only negotiation that's taking place is we want the Constitution to be upheld. We want the laws of Venezuela to be upheld, period. There is nothing that the opposition is asking in the negotiations that have occurred that is illegitimate, that is absurd, that is crazy. No, what they're asking for is let's go back to the law. Let's focus on the Constitution. And if we do that, a lot of things could start getting solved. What Maduro is doing is I won't leave power. I'm going to make myself such a pest, okay, that I'm actually, people will have to deal with me and figure out a way. Well, we can't get rid of Maduro. We have to find a way to coexist with Maduro. But the notion of democratic coexistence with indicted criminals is impossible. So what the Trump team did is they lay out what the problem was. They followed the line of the Constitution in Venezuela. What the Biden team now has to do is say, how do we deal with it? Who engages with Maduro? What kind of conversations do we have so that that playing field is more level? Okay, do we create conditions so that it's the two parties, local parties, can sit down but in a level playing field, or do we negotiate? Do we sit down? Do we negotiate, between the United States and a group of countries against those who are backing Maduro? Do we present a set of carrots and sticks to Maduro and his group of people? How do we do that? But that's the job the Biden team has right now. They really have to, on the basis of everything that has been tried, not start anew, just incrementally understand that asking the Venezuelan opposition along the ways of what Norway is trying to do, of facilitating a conversation between the kidnapped and the kidnappers, that has no chance of success. Zero chance of success. What I'm talking about, a negotiation with those people that do have the power, okay, to bend the will of both Maduro and his supporters, that doesn't have a huge possibility of success, but has some possibility of success. When the Norwegian approach, sadly, has zero chance of success. And I think as long as Norway continues to facilitate thinking that this is a political problem and giving the impression to Maduro that he can survive, that he can coexist for a long time despite all the crimes that he's committed, and actually receive impunity as a guarantee, we're in an absurd path. I believe that there's a group of people, Carlos, a group of people, maybe we can reduce it to a small group of people in the Maduro regime that cannot survive impune. That doesn't mean that people who sympathize with Chavez, who worked and collaborated with Chavez, who worked and collaborated with Maduro, have to be banned from anything. No, they have to participate. I would love to see a free and fair election with a Chavista running for office, but a Chavista who doesn't have a criminal record, a Chavista who has not abused human rights, just somebody who sympathizes. Because the one thing I would love to hear in a campaign is, what does Chavismo stand for? I know how it worked while Chavez was in power. It was the distribution, wanton, disorderly, unstructured distribution of an oil price boom. That's what Chavismo was. Now, in a ruined society, okay, where we need assistance from all over the world to put this country together, I would love to see what Chavismo looks like. So rather than banning Chavismo from participating in politics, I want them to participate in politics. But what I don't think makes any sense is because the bad guys are really bad, that we have to create space for those 20, 30, or 40 bad guys. The difficult situation right now is, how do you deal with those 40 guys so that the rest of society can come up with an arrangement? Because until you focus and deal with those guys the way the Statute of Rome, of which Venezuela is a signatory, until you deal with it that way, we can't proceed. And the fact is, and I will just say this is not my opinion. The people who are studying what's going on in Venezuela have already stated that crimes against humanity are taking place in Venezuela, and have gone as far as listing those people who are responsible. That is a starting point of any negotiation. So the guys who took the hostages in the bank, have a long criminal record. So when you think about negotiating with them, you have to understand that, and not think that the cashiers or the clients of the bank are going to be easily not only negotiate their freedom, but they have no guarantees to provide to these individuals. No guarantees whatsoever. So we have to change the scheme of negotiation. We have to change, the tack. We have to change the parties to the negotiation. And if we don't do that, I promise you, it's not 5.5 million people that will have left Venezuela. 10 million people would have left Venezuela. And the crisis will be a complete crisis in the entire region, and also a crisis in the US.
It will be interesting to find that unicorn, not corrupt, not tied to the crimes against humanity, and calling himself a Madurista or whatever. That will be interesting. Maybe there's somewhere. But you're right. One of the things that we have to also admit, that the sanctions, even though some of them involve lack of planning, some of them were good planning, it's one of the factors that the Maduro administration always mentions. So that means that it matters. Sadly, there was not an effort from the whole international community to sanction the regime, and left some open spaces for the regime to operate. We only have 1 minute left, and I'm going to give you that minute to you to comment about the plans from the regime to create a new normal, to create a new economic situation that's going to open the markets. That's why they need to lift some of the sanctions, begin to create new business sectors, and open the economy to from Venezuela to other investors, to allow them to operate. Is there any possibility for that plan from Maduro senior circle to be successful, or not?
Well, in 1 minute, I want to take a little bit of that, say, without sanctions, Maduro would have never sat down to negotiate in this last few rounds. So sanctions are critical to balance and level the playing field. The FARC in Colombia would have never gone to negotiate if they're not being bombed and their camps are not being bombed and their leaders are not being killed. So, I mean, I call that a huge sanction. I mean, in the case of a criminal organization like the FARC, they went to a negotiation because their alternative to negotiating was to be obliterated. In the sense here, the same thing. Sanctions have been very, very important. I agree with you that they have not sometimes been applied with this coordination and the totality. I think that will continue. I've actually seen the Biden administration say that they want to do more intelligent sanctions, and they'll continue ratcheting it up if a change does not occur. In terms of bringing normality to a country with no institutions, that's impossible, okay? In a winner-take-all environment where you're basically operate at the whim of the state and the state will take over your property or put you in jail, put whatever, there's no possibility of normalization. I can see how they want to do that. I can see how they can distribute the spoils among their cronies, but that is not a viable society. And that is a society that will continue expulsing people, that will not generate enough jobs. Venezuela will continue to be very poor unless it's a dramatic change towards a free, society with functioning institutions that have to be rebuilt and an economy that has to start from zero, providing opportunities and jobs for people. I actually believe that under any scenario, Venezuela is going to continue to be a huge problem because it is a very big problem we're dealing with. These little solutions in which cronies, you go from this crazy disorganized thing to crony capitalism is not going to work without institutions.
Yes, more clear, impossible. So the only solution for Venezuela is a solution with so many things on stake, so many different avenues, so many scenarios that need a major approach. And in this, of course, this situation and this kidnapping can continue. It can get worse. And thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Pedro Mario. This has been an extraordinary. We can keep talking and talking for several hours. Thank you for your clear view and for your contribution, recommending different strategies and policies. And for because you have been here listening to us and for your contribution with DOC. Thank you for being here with us today, and I hope that we're gonna see you in our next event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.